My name's Charles Secret. I've mostly worked in NGOs in the environment and sustainability movement, and a preoccupation of mine during those 30 years or so has been around citizen action. And I believe, and what I want to share with you today, that the secret to what we need to do to catalyse business and government to do the right thing is by citizens, communities, and then countries joining together to work for the common good. And I don't think we should underestimate at all how precarious the situation is as far as civilization is concerned. And I don't say that out of any sense of melodrama or exaggeration. Just look at what happens in the world today. I mean, if we look at the biosphere, for 15,000 years as civilization has arisen, the biosphere has been basically stable. Well, human activity is destabilizing it. Unprecedented rates of species extinction, ocean acidification, the loss of fisheries like there's no tomorrow, ecosystems from forest to grasslands disappearing, and worst and most worrying of all, runaway climate change, extreme weather events, and impending sea level rise threatening us in this century. It's not the planet that's at risk, it's civilization. Look at the inequalities, social and economic, between and within nations, between and within races. Wherever we look, politically, economically, and environmentally, we are going down the tubes. We have a small window of opportunity to do something about it. If that's the bad news, the good news is that we have plenty of money, plenty of ideas, plenty of success stories, of technology, of innovation, of willing people, of cooperative endeavour, on entrepreneurial spirit, and answers to get us out of the mess that we're in. But for some reason, we're not building a critical mass where good happens rather than bad. And I believe that we can change that if we come together around an agenda that makes environmental, economic and social sense, not just for elites, but for everybody. That's the prospect on offer. But where's that change going to come from? It's going to come from government. It has to come through government, but I don't know about you, but I don't believe that any generation has been more cursed by a more useless set of political leaders than ours. And I don't mean just in this country, I mean globally. I can think of very, very few countries where I would trust the government to actually do the right thing. And most of those, not exclusively, I can think of one or two in the south, but most of those are based around that cluster of countries in Northern Europe. And that's not because I agree with all the political nostrums of the reigning parties, but because I think the government there is engaged with its people, generally tries to do good, and gets a better balance between environment, social and economic priorities than elsewhere. Is it going to come from business? Well, government in most parts of the world is desperately trying to minimise and shrink the state so corporations can take over and provide the human as well as the production and wealth creation needs that everyone wants. Personally, I don't think it's going to come from business, though private capital has an essential role to play in getting things right. Of course, business has to be part of the solution, but it cannot be the solution. Markets have to be regulated. Companies have to be regulated. And they have to be incentivized to do the right thing. Is it going to come from society itself? Well, I don't think so. I think society without leadership and coordination and a coalescence of common interests is too loose-knit. Where is it going to come from? Well, I think that the place a catalyst can be amongst a whole range of different organisations, progressive movements that are sometimes political, sometimes social, and sometimes economic. The progressive movements in this country, environment, social welfare, animal welfare, anti-poverty, pro-development, looking after southern countries, civil liberties, human rights. The established NGOs have so many resources. They have, just in this country alone, let alone globally, they have tens of thousands of staff. In the environment movement, their collective budget is over £100 million annually. They are full of enthusiasm, of skills, of expertise, of committed staff, of membership that runs into the millions. And this is just the environment lot. Now, if all these movements looked at where their common interest lies, it's like a Venn diagram. In the centre, what they say are the problems and what they say are the solutions are complementary. So why don't they come together and work together and be the catalyst for change? Along with the activist networks, the more radical ones that spread laterally across the country. Things like Occupy or tax justice, or the Robin Hood tax movement. There are so many of them that aren't part of the established NGOs, but bring their own strengths. And then there are the electronic networks like 38 Degrees or Avaz. 38 Degrees in this country has got almost 1 million members. Avaz globally has nearly 18 million members. Can you imagine what would happen if these people all started working together and pooling their resources for a common agenda of change? We could change things, we really could change things. But it needs catalysing and mobilising. Each have their weaknesses. You can't foster a revolution through electronic networks. That type of ersatz communication through Facebook or Google Plus or Twitter doesn't build trust. You have to meet face to face. The NGOs are locked into policy debates and bureaucracy. They've got to break out of the Whitehall lobbying farce that they constantly dance around in. And the activist networks have got to understand that there's only so long you can camp out or protest before the law or the weather beats you. So the weaknesses and their strengths complement each other. If only they would see the common interests that they have. I'll give you a couple of examples before I wind up. The National Trust mobilised its members, 4 million of them, 1 in 10 voters belong to the National Trust, to stop the government's planning reforms. Tory and Liberal and Labour MPs freaked out and said, we can't go along with these changes to the planning laws. We've got to stop them. And the whip said, why? It's the government has decided it's going to go ahead. No, because all our constituents are getting angry. We won't get elected if we press ahead. So the government backed down. Save Our Forest campaign, when they tried to privatise the forests. It wasn't the NGOs that jumped in, it was communities and individuals who said, no, we don't want our forests privatised, thanks very much. The government backed down. When I was running Friends of the Earth, we set up 12 different campaigns to push through private members' bills, at first the Conservative government and then new Labour government at the executive level, with huge majorities in the legislature, said, over our dead bodies is this going to go through? Road Traffic Reduction Acts, Anti-Waste Acts, Energy Efficiency Acts, the Warm Home and Energy Conservation Act to outlaw fuel poverty. The law itself's not enough, and we didn't win that one, but we got the bill through as an act, and the Climate Change Act to set targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In every single case, the government said no. So we organised locally in every single constituency around the country. We built coalitions of the willing between environment groups, social groups, political groups, business groups, and we did that nationally. And we held our representatives to account. And we did it in a non-party political way. And it worked. And the government backed down. Now, laws are not enough. That was just one step forward. We now need to do it for a whole range of different policy measures. We need to encourage business that's doing the right thing to carry on doing the right thing and drive the cowboys out of business, just as we have to get rid of politicians who don't work for the common good. Where does the licence to lead come from? It doesn't come from this house or next door. It comes from constituents. It comes from taxpayers. It comes from voters. If we organise and galvanise and mobilise, we can change things. Where does the licence to operate for business come from? It doesn't come from executives or boardrooms. It comes from consumers. It comes from shareholders. It comes from investors. If we want to change markets and governments to create the type of society where we live in harmony with each other and our planet, we can do it if we mobilise around an agenda of change that genuinely listens to people and what they want, works with them in their communities, organises on this coalition basis, and then makes sure that we support the good guys and girls in government and business and drive the others out of here, because we don't need them. Thanks very much indeed.
You can understand my agony in closing that down, but I'm sure with Charles's permission I can send you all, if you've signed the email list which is going around, please make sure you do, I can send you his full article from the Resurgence, which swells that out very strongly. You'll see its pertinence in the next 3 contributions very clearly indeed. And now I introduce our moderator for these Quilligan seminars, and he will indicate why we've exercised from many starting points this exploration of our minds and our hearts and our commitment. James.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for everyone who's organized this, and thank you for the wonderful beginning to this, Charles. We are here to celebrate the memory in these seminars of Eleanor Ostrom, who passed away over the summer. She was a tremendous visionary in the Commons movement, and the Commons movement has inspired many of us and is increasingly doing so. What is Commons? What does this mean? What are we talking about? In one way, Commons is what is not regulated by the state and what's not privatized by corporations or businesses. And that's an easy way to look at the meaning of common resources. It's the things we share in common that have been outsourced, the management or production has been outsourced to the state or to business. Another way to look at it is that it's about being present to what is really in front of us, the realities that are part of our ontological structure in the communities. And this now gives us the opportunity to say that we really need to create political accountability structures and production structures that are more resonant with the local needs of managing our own resources, to infuse our understanding of how to produce and coalesce our management over our common resources in a new way. And this is the primary vision of the Commons movement, how to do this. Now, there are many groups working on different issues. All of those issues, there are probably 1 million NGOs in the world today, or many more probably. All of those are working on commons issues, although they may not realize them as commons issues. But indeed, air quality and food and seeds and the whole range of issues among NGOs has to do with the commons. But what's missing is that local political accountability structure that involves subsidiarity and polycentricity and pluralism, horizontal decision-making, that really anchors the decision-making at the local levels. In spite of the fact that we have all these different agencies working toward global change, they're not coordinating their efforts, but that's probably because there's not a common agenda. I would submit that the source code that we really need is in bits and pieces across all of those different NGOs around the world. What we need to do is organize them. And at a minimum, I'd like to set forth some of the propositions that I think are part of that source code that needs to coalesce. Many of us think, and I see this all the time, that the solution to the ecological problem is that we need to adjust prices in the marketplace. But the fact is that prices are only a symptom of the underlying problem, which is that both the supply and the demand for money are manipulated. Under the present system, commercial banks create the supply of money as a source of interest-bearing debt and private profit, while national central banks control interest rates to manage the demand for new money created by the commercial banks as loans. So the real problem is not about adjusting prices in the marketplace. It's about how to break this monopoly and align the value of public money with the value of our common resources. Putting the money system back into people's hands and turning money, not the prices of goods and services, but the value of our currency into a source of motivation and incentives that support the survival and well-being of society and the planet. That seems to me to be the central goal. Our commons, the shared resources of humanity, give us a clear vision of the purpose of money and how we can make the monetary adjustment that's needed. The first thing this involves is debt-free currency. The value arising from creating the public money supply is a commons and should be seen as a public revenue, not private profit. Our money supply has to be converted from interest-paying debt to debt-free money issued by an agency that is publicly held and managed. The central bank must become an agency that has oversight by the public and issues debt-free currency and spends it into circulation for public purposes. By managing the money supply for the common good, we'll stop generating interest to drive the demand for money as debt. And instead of interest-bearing currency flowing into speculative projects, debt-free money will go into projects that foster the long-term value of the commons and that benefit society. The second thing is replacing the interest rate with something that's being called the sustainability rate. And this is fast developing among many people who are working on the new metrics. To replace this interest-bearing money with debt-free money doesn't mean that the new currency has no value. A debt-free currency is not value-free. Under a new global monetary reserve system, the common assets of the planet would form the basis of a new standard of value expressing our collective intentions for sustainability. Sustainability rate would mean that the withdrawal rates of renewable resources are equilibrated with their replenishment rates.
Could you go just a bit slower so we can take it in?
Sure.
Thank you.
Tell us what NGOs are, please, because somebody doesn't understand.
Non-governmental organizations,
Right, thank you.
civil society organizations.
Sorry, is this being videoed anyway?
Yes.
Is it being recorded?
Yes.
So we could watch it again anyway.
Yes. Yeah, and the reason I'm going at this pace is that I want to paint a big picture. So if you don't absorb it all, I would like you to be able to, but this is also for the public record as well. So I will slow down a tad.
And the paper will be available.
And
We
the paper.
will make, from the School of Commoning, we will make everything available anyways.
What the concept of sustainability rate really means is that the withdrawal rates of renewable resources have to be balanced with their replenishment rates. That's what this rate would reflect at a global level. So this means that the signals about the actual scarcity of resources and the cost of environmental damage and social disparities are now conveyed directly through our money, not through the price of goods and services. When global sustainability is expressed through currency value, then each of us has an immediate realization of the potential impact of our purchasing power in spending, saving, or investing. This makes it worth less to do ecological and social harm and worth more to us personally to be ecologically and socially restorative. And the value expressed through this sustainability rate for our currency in every exchange of goods and services is secured by the resilience and diversity of the world's material, natural, genetic, cultural, social, and intellectual resources. Now, the third point is that we need community organizations which have a rich history from the past. In many places across the world, people do share particular resources, and the management of these resources includes their users and their producers and their providers. They're managing them through unique forms of self-governance and collaboration. Whether these commons are traditional, that involves rivers or forests, indigenous cultures, or emerging commons like solar energy or intellectual property or the internet, communities and bioregions are now taking collective action to preserve their resources for future generations. Because neither of our existing property regimes today, private nor governmental, have a mandate to provide fair access and long-term protection for the common resources of society. These new kinds of trusts, these political accountability structures, are created through customary norms or through social charters, and they declare new rules and conditions by which people help each other manage and produce what each of them needs. Common trusts are the only legal and fiduciary institutions that are dedicated to protecting the commons for future generations. This is really critical, because that way they create value not through property ownership, but through sustainability and quality of life and well-being of our commons. Now, trusteeships have a unique power to place a cap on resources. And this cap on the access and impact and extraction and use of an ecosystem indicates how much the withdrawal rates from the resources have to be slowed to allow for their replenishment. This gives our common resources protection under public trust law, enabling a trust to set a limit on the maximum extraction and use of its commons to preserve them for future generations. Now, the genius behind this new kind of vision that's emerging in the commons movement is that the trusts are then able to rent the surplus of these resources to businesses. The trustees of the resource can decide that a proportion of their common resources can be leased by the trust to the private sector or to state businesses and utilities for extraction and production. So instead of owning a resource, businesses rent the rights to extract and produce the resource from the trust. The private sector profits through the extraction and production of the surplus resource rented to them by the common sector, and the businesses can thrive because their financial incentives continue to operate as they do now. But what's interesting about this model is now that the rental or user fees received by these trusts for the extraction or use of the commons by business or government are reinvested back into the management or restoration of the depleted resource. So this takes regulation of the commons out of the hands of government and allows the people who depend on their own commons for survival and well-being to make their own decisions and participate in the management and conservation of their common resources. Then the next step is that the tax on the value added to the commons that we have now becomes a tax on the value subtracted from the commons. Presently, taxes are imposed on incomes, profits, earnings from work, and value, and that is value added, which people and businesses generate by adding value to the commonwealth and well-being. But instead of taxing our positive contributions to the commons, we should be taxing the value that's subtracted from the commons by those who benefit from the rising value of shared resources. So a major shift is needed from taxing the value that people add to the commons for the benefit of society and nature to the value that people subtract from the commons for private self-interest. This would redistribute more fairly the publicly created value of resources, which should be shared in common. The next step is that businesses extract, produce, use the common resource and they profit from this. But a portion of these profits is taxed by government and spent on public services. And the revenue derived from taxing the value that's subtracted from the commons is used as a social dividend and provided to every person as a right of citizenship. It's a new source of public revenue that's generated by taxing the wealth subtracted from the extraction and use of our common resources for private benefit and provided directly to all citizens as their fair share in the value of the commons. Now, what this creates is a unity between tax revenue and public spending. Presently, tax revenues are disconnected from public spending. One set of people collects the tax revenue and another set of people spends the money. These agencies are entirely different. They have different objectives. So the new role of government is to seek a balance between the taxes from citizens to the state for public spending with the basic income that transfers money from the state to citizens. In this way, the supply of money in circulation is matched with the demand for goods and services needed. Now, taking this to the global level, we need an international monetary system with a global currency, a sustainability rate, and a system of global public revenue collection that would provide new incentives to live in ways that conserve and restore common resources, and that enable people to meet their own needs and that of their families and communities, and distribute the value of the commons more widely and fairly. We could establish a rental fee on many trans-border commons, and that rental fee could generate public revenue from the commons that would be directly targeted toward global public spending on food, water, healthcare, education, jobs, and the whole range of development issues that we're familiar with. That would be a trans-border tax on things like international airline tickets and ocean transport and satellite parking spaces and global financial transaction tax. There's a whole litany of proposals out there about global financial revenue streams that could be created to create this kind of mechanism. Each of the areas would be, each of the sectors that would be taxed, the money, the revenues would go directly back into that sector to replenish and restore the resources that have been depleted. And also at the local level, commons currencies, local alternative currencies, also be developed by trusts of resource users and producers who manage a shared commons. That cap that I was talking about earlier, it preserves equity of the resource for the future. That equity can be turned into a standard of value that directly can link to alternative currencies. Capping a resource, then a commons trust can function as a commons bank, issuing debt-free currency at a sustainability rate based on the reserve assets protected under the cap. Commons currency then unleashes the local creativity and interdependence and abundance of the local community and increases purchasing power to meet local needs through local work and the use of local resources. Then the local economy becomes stronger and more resilient because it's matching the quality of goods and services with the quantity of money in circulation, and that enhances cooperation and community building. Now, to wrap this up, what this all entails is a new vision of supply and demand, because essentially that's at the source of the problem. We're moving from ownership to trusteeship, but we're also recognizing that supply-side economics has failed us miserably. That's what's driving the problem. Interest rates are creating the need for a kind of supply-side economics as we've had. We need to balance the demand side with the supply side. This is what Keynes had tried to do. It wasn't fully robust enough to make it happen. We need to devise a new way of making it happen, a new framework in Western economics that's needed to evolve, because under the old system, we've said that supply creates its own demand. The philosophy of build it and they will come. But the commons demonstrate that it's the interior values of people, individually and collectively, that are the means by which exterior systems change. This is how inner demand is balanced with outer supply. So our currency has to set the intentions for collective sustainability. It's through our system of monetary value that the inner value of all individuals together is expressed through the inherent conditions of planetary resources, not through the external prices in the marketplace. Debt-free currency with a sustainability rate, commons trusts capping resources, renting the surplus to businesses and creating a revenue stream to manage and restore the commons, and taxing the value subtracted from the commons to generate a basic income. That means uniting tax revenue with public spending, creating global commons revenue to fund global public spending, and creating then commons currencies to make local economies stronger and more resilient. These measures will automatically balance demand with supply. That will be a whole new world, and that's the proposition that I'm proposing to you. I hold that space so that many of you can find your place in that, but this larger, expansive vision is something that I wanted to introduce to you so that we could generate a sense of alliance between our different interest groups. Thank you.
That paper will come to you within a few days. That rich context indicates why it's so important to trust all the different contributions and to work with each other to improve each other's ability to add to that whole picture. And now we move to a concept of the people's movement from Frank, and he'll introduce himself.
Yes, thank you, Peter. My name's Frank Taylor. I've been running a thing called the Runnymede Project for the last 3 or 4 years. Part of its purpose is implied in its name, with its allusion to the Magna Carta of fundamental constitutional and civil liberties values. By constitutional values, I mean this, that in 1688, in what's now called the Glorious Revolution, at the Congress, King William asked a question of the Congress. He asked, "How do you wish to be governed?" And the answer to that question was what is now called the Bill of Rights. Fundamentally, we all have to answer the question, how do we wish to be governed? We certainly don't wish to be governed in the way that we are currently being governed in both the economic and the political spheres, a system that has now become utterly rotten to the core in all aspects imaginable. I publish every month a thing called the Runnymede Gazette, which draws from such sources as activist posts and global research and similar bodies. And anyone's welcome to achieve that. We've had a couple of conferences. We were going to have another one this year, only all this happened, which rather put the kibosh on it. Last year we had a sort of mini conference and a meeting at a place called Purton, just outside Swindon, which is the home of the former editor of Fourth World Review, a man called John Packwood. Some in here may have heard of him and may be aware of Fourth World Review. And we put our heads together and came up with a blueprint for the creation of what is in a sense a cellular resistance movement. It is intended only and only ever was intended as a spinal structure, a minimalistic structure which would create the opportunity for others to fill in the flesh and the bones and the sinews as we go along. But just to explain a bit of the background to this, I mean, activists all over the place are constantly exchanging emails and running websites and organising small campaigns and occasionally writing articles and reading articles and creating publications and sometimes going on the streets with a demonstration or whatever. The first thing is that a lot of this is directed to single campaign issues, and single campaign issues rarely meet critical mass, and the overall achievement of what you would call critical mass is absolutely essential. But it remains elusive. How are we going to do it? Whilst all this is going on, the library shelves are absolutely groaning under the weight of charters and manifestos and schemes and designs and wonderful statements of intent. And all of this, unless you've got a vehicle for actually achieving what you want to achieve, all this becomes, relatively speaking, a complete waste of time. Unless we can find a practical organisational means of getting from where we are to where we want to be, at least part of the road, we're not even getting half a mile along this road at the moment, then it all becomes a relative waste of time. So really, from a practical standpoint, how do we achieve this critical mass? Firstly, 3 truths have to be addressed. The first thing is that there's no such thing as a single issue. The second thing is that single issues, or what appear to be single issues, all connect together. In other words, the grievances, most of the grievances we suffer come back to a single source, and that source is the grotesque concentration of political and economic power into very, very few hands, both nationally and internationally. And the truth related to this is that we are now governed by, both nationally and internationally, by a kleptocratic oligarchy that considers itself to be above government. It considers itself to be above law, it considers itself to be above morality and decency, and it considers itself to be above taxation. Somehow we have to break this government, we have to break this rule. And the third truth is that, of course, these oligarchs couldn't give a damn about our charters, our declarations, our words, and our puny little street demonstrations. And if somebody breaks the odd window in one of those demonstrations, it's not even a farthing out of their wallets. Plus the fact that they've made you look complete idiots. We tend to believe that all we need to do to resolve our problems is appeal to a pedagogic solution. We tend to believe that once the truth is revealed, once we've got to this great Alan Partridge moment, the aha moment, you know, I've got it, I understand, I get the message, that all else will somehow automatically fall into place, and that all the tumblers of the lock will simply fall into place automatically, and that the solutions will find themselves of their own volition. That this is purely a matter of education and understanding. And okay, education and understanding and disseminating the details of what lies behind our grievances is part of the picture. It is a necessary prerequisite to change, but it is not a sufficient prerequisite to change. Something more than that is needed. And what is needed is organisation. And what is needed is not simply organisation, but organisation of a certain type and character. Bearing in mind experiences that organisations and campaigns have had previously with things that have gone wrong. There have been quite a number of harbingers of rebellion around the world, from the Tea Party to Occupy, and maybe, as people like Noam Chomsky have pointed out, the differences between some of these elements is not as big as some of the rhetoric might imply. There are a lot of unhappy people out there who realise that things are going drastically wrong. So we may have more in common with different movements than at first appears. We've recently had Occupy. I think that expected too much too quickly from too narrow and too small an organising base. I think on both sides, particularly on the American side of the Atlantic, there was this expectation that the whole thing would rapidly turn viral and all these millions of people would storm the gates of Babylon, and it didn't happen. Because we face a formidably well-organised oligarchy, a very wealthy oligarchy, one that knows all the tricks of the trade, one that can be pretty ruthless. And if the signs are as they're coming through at the moment, then it looks as if the oligarchs on both sides of the Atlantic are tooling up for serious unrest, and that things could get seriously nasty over the next few years. And many of us would expect that to happen. But from the point of view of achieving critical mass, it is not going to be quick or easy. One problem is that we rely, a point that Charles made earlier, too much on the internet. The internet has many uses, but the thing is that its use requires very little effort and absolutely no commitment. And to that extent, it is nothing more than a huge toy. Yes, I want marshmallow on Thursday, but I'll have Mars bars on Friday, and it's just a question of passing fad and fancy. So, internet-generated campaigns tend to be short-lived. They shoot like fireworks spectacularly across the heavens, and 10 minutes later, 5 minutes later, they've fizzled out and just fallen to earth like so much burnt-out dross. Internet-generated campaigning has yet to demonstrate any real sense of endurance, stamina or cohesion, I think, in any internet-generated campaign. What we have to do is to create on-the-ground organisation. And we have to start, in my view, from the premises that we behave as if we were the occupants and the inhabitants and citizens of an occupied state, which in a sense we are. Yeah. So we have to add depth to this activity. We have to add coherence, consistency, and a willingness in some cases for personal sacrifice. We need stamina, we need a sense of cohesion. That can't be done by the internet. We tend to be very formulaic in our campaigning. Maybe I can return to that later. It's ritualised and formulaic. But we must think of the role that the correspondence committees played in the American Revolution, as well as in the struggle for civil liberties and freedom of speech in this country in the 18th century. So we need some form of local cellular-based system by which people from different campaigning backgrounds can join hands, right, and communicate with one another, find areas of commonality, and so forth. I think this is the first of the new Putney debates, and the last of the Quilligan seminars all rolled into one, in a sense. Churchill told this country in 1940 that unless we prevail, we would enter a new dark age made more protracted in the light of perverted science. This is the choice we now have to make as to whether a 1,000-year development of civil liberty is to end and be thrown into reverse into some new form of tyranny. Now, unlike the first Putney debates, unlike those who initiated those, Lilburne, Rainborough and so forth, Colonel Rainborough, we don't have a new model army, and I think our challenge is to create one.
Thank you very much. I apologise to speakers.